The night the factory lights flickered, every worker on that floor felt something was wrong. Not the usual kind of wrong that comes from long shifts or bad wiring or machines that rattle when they've been overworked. No, this was a different kind of wrong, the kind that settles on your skin, like dust before you even see where it came from. People paused for just a second, glancing up at the ceiling as the bulbs dimmed and brightened. Some chalked it up to the weather. Others blamed the old panels. But deep inside every person on that shift, there was a quiet fear they couldn't explain. They didn't know it yet, but someone wasn't making it home alive. And the man responsible? He was already planning the speech he'd give to avoid taking the blame. He'd already rehearsed his lines, practiced his sympathy, straightened his tie, and convinced himself that cutting corners was the same thing as being efficient. Back then, none of us could have predicted how far he'd go to hide what he did, or how far I'd go to make sure he couldn't. Before I take you into the heart of what a wicked person is capable of, the lies, the ignored warnings, the grief he tried to bury under paperwork, make sure you subscribe to Revenge Castle. Stories like this deserve witnesses, not silence. Also, hit like so the algorithm knows you stand on the side of the people who work their jobs with diligence and not the people who cash checks from people's pain. My story begins in a town many people forget existed once they drive past the factories on the edge of the highway. It's the kind of place built from dust and overtime, where the scent of metal and oil lingers in the air, and you learn early that the safest job isn't really safe at all. The buildings don't look old from the outside, but inside, every wall has heard the same complaints for decades. The floors are stained with hard work and the kind of exhaustion people pretend doesn't count because it isn't glamorous. My parents raised me and my younger brother in a house too small for our dreams, but just big enough for hope. My father worked in construction until his back gave out. My mother cleaned offices until her knees couldn't kneel anymore. We didn't have much, but we understood the value of showing up even when everything inside you wanted to stop. My brother Miguel was the kind of person people liked instantly. He had that easy warmth, that laugh that could cut through tension, that steady way of working that men twice his age respected. When I got the office job at Westline Manufacturing, he followed a year later, working the floor. He liked the noise, the movement, the rhythm of heavy metal sliding across conveyor belts. He took pride in being useful. No matter how tired he was, he always said it felt good to contribute. And he did contribute, more than he ever should have had to. Westline was known for being generous with overtime and stingy with safety. Everyone knew it. People joked about it, because joking is the only way to survive something you can't control. Every time the government announced new workplace safety standards, Westline sent out glossy emails about striving for excellence. Meanwhile, on the floor, machines shook like old men climbing stairs. Alarms chirped for days before anyone bothered to examine them. Guards meant to protect workers went missing, or broken, or taped in place with the kind of shortcuts you'd never see in a company brochure. The worst of them was the main conveyor line in Section C. Calling it a machine doesn't feel accurate. It was more like a giant metal animal that had survived too many winters. Everyone knew the line was failing. Belts slipped, rollers jammed, sensors malfunctioned in ways that could have taken fingers or more. Workers submitted reports. Maintenance begged for shutdowns. Supervisors nodded and said they'd look into it. But the man who made the decisions, the one with the corner office, the shiny boots, and the watch more expensive than my rent, believed in profit before prevention. Randall Pierce. He was the kind of boss who loved talking about efficiency while never stepping foot near the machines that tore through the lives of the people he supervised. He was the sort of man who'd smile with his teeth when inspectors came, offering them coffee and charm. But the minute they left, he'd send out emails instructing the floor to push production harder and minimize downtime. He always spoke about safety like it was optional, as though caution was a luxury only companies that weren't trying to survive could afford. I can still picture him standing above the floor, hands clasped behind his back, looking down at workers like they were pieces on a chessboard. He didn't see exhaustion or fear or effort. He saw numbers. He saw output. He saw the kind of ambition that didn't care what it crushed along the way. And every time someone mentioned the conveyor line, he'd laugh with that dismissive, smug tone, saying things like, "It's not that bad," or "That's what maintenance is for," or "People just love to complain." He turned danger into an inconvenience, and inconvenience into a joke. If you've ever had a boss like that, you know exactly how it feels to stand under the weight of their indifference. You know the helplessness of watching issues pile up while they shrug at the risk. You know what it's like to feel fear and frustration sitting in your throat with nowhere to go. You know what it's like to be told to stop being dramatic when you're the one standing inches from a machine that could tear you apart. And deep down, you know what it's like to pray that the next shift doesn't end in blood. I wish I could tell you we imagined the danger. I wish I could say the warning signs were vague or exaggerated, but that would be a lie. The truth is that we felt the danger in our bones long before anything happened. And on that night, the night the lights flickered and the air shifted, everyone knew the building was holding its breath, everyone except the one man who had the power to prevent what came next. Randall didn't care. Randall never cared. Randall believed he was untouchable. And when someone like him believes nothing can break, something always does. The night the lights flickered was supposed to be an ordinary Tuesday. Westline had no such thing as a slow day. The floor always buzzed with the same frantic energy, the same echo of metal grinding against metal, the same metallic scent thick in the air. Tuesdays were the worst because the rush to catch up from the weekend created pressure nobody could see, but everyone felt. The machines strained harder. Workers moved faster. Supervisors checked the clock more than they checked the equipment. But that night felt different before anything happened. It felt heavier. The air carried something tense and electric, like a warning that hovered just beyond the corners of the building. Workers noticed the way the machinery hummed off-key, the way the conveyor belts jolted suddenly, as if trying to keep up with demands their bodies couldn't match. You could feel the tension ripple through the room in the way men glanced at one another, the way people adjusted gloves or tightened helmets nervously, the way everyone moved with slightly more caution. Even I felt it from the office upstairs. I sat staring at spreadsheets that blurred together, listening to every faint alarm, every screech of metal, every thud of machinery. When you've worked in a factory long enough, you learn to hear danger before it arrives. You feel it in the shift of the building, in the tone of the machines, in the subtle changes that only the people who work too close to them can detect. That night, even the hum of the fluorescent lights sounded wrong. Miguel had texted me a few minutes past 7, right before the floor got too loud to hear a phone vibrate. Just a photo of his workstation, messy, crowded, full of half-finished pallets. A joking caption about Section C trying to kill him again. He'd sent messages like that before, but tonight the humor felt thin, forced, like he knew something was off but didn't want to worry me. Whenever Miguel worked in Section C, I felt that quiet dread in the back of my mind. It was the one area I had complained about more than anything else, the one area that made my chest tighten whenever I walked by. I knew the reports. I knew the requests that were filed and ignored. I'd seen the maintenance logs marked completed when nothing had been fixed. I'd watched supervisors shrug and push the problem down the line like a burden that would magically resolve itself if they pretended hard enough. That conveyor belt in Section C wasn't just faulty, it was dangerous. Everyone on the floor knew it. The maintenance team knew it. The supervisors knew it. Even the floor leads whispered about it on their lunch breaks. The only person who refused to acknowledge it was the one man whose acknowledgement mattered most. Randall believed downtime was a threat. Randall believed repairs were negotiable. Randall believed human bodies were replaceable in a way machinery was not. And because of that, every creak, every jerk, every tremor from the Section C conveyor was a ticking clock, a countdown no one could see the numbers on. Workers lived with that countdown every day. Some pretended not to hear it. Some lived with the knot in their stomachs. Some prayed quietly during breaks. But everyone knew it existed. Still, most of them believed, maybe out of necessity, that the worst wouldn't happen to them. That danger circled around other people. That accidents were something you heard about but never witnessed up close. Miguel wasn't naive. He knew the risks more than most. He'd told me once that he didn't trust the machines, but he trusted himself. He trusted his awareness, his speed, his focus. And I understood the logic because when you grow up in a small town with more factories than job opportunities, you learn to swallow risk like medicine you never wanted to take. I checked the clock. 7:48 p.m. The lights flickered again. Even from the office window, I could see the hesitation ripple through the floor. Movement slowed by a fraction. Eyes darted upward. A few workers paused their tasks for a breath too long. But when the lights settled back into place, everyone kept working. Fear doesn't stop production. Fear doesn't stop quotas. Fear doesn't stop people who need their paycheck. Fear only makes you hope harder that today isn't the day something breaks. I got up from my desk and walked toward the window overlooking Section C. I watched Miguel for a moment. Though he couldn't see me from where he stood, he moved quickly, lifting heavy parts, guiding them into place, adjusting the controls he had adjusted 1,000 times before. He looked tired, but not exhausted, focused, but not distracted, determined, but not reckless, the kind of worker any decent boss would kill to have. But Randall didn't value workers. He valued output. As I leaned against the railing of the office window, I saw something that made my stomach twist hard enough to make my breath stutter. One of the floor leads, a man with a clipboard in hand, waved toward the control panel at the end of the conveyor. Something was wrong with the sensors. I recognized the motions instantly, the hand signals workers used when equipment misread weight or alignment. I knew what should have happened next. Stop the line, clear the area, reset the sensors, fix the issue. But none of that happened. The floor lead looked toward the mezzanine, toward Randall's office window, as if seeking permission. Randall wasn't even inside. His coat hung over the chair, his papers scattered across the desk. He was somewhere on the floor, but nowhere useful. The supervisor shouted something over the noise, something I couldn't hear, but recognized from the motion of his arms. Keep going. Keep going. That phrase was a death sentence whispered through every factory I'd ever worked in. Keep going meant ignore the risk. Keep going meant pretend the problem wasn't there. Keep going meant someone up top had decided that human life wasn't worth 30 minutes of downtime. Miguel kept working. He always kept working. He trusted the system not to fail him, because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. At 8:03 p.m., the alarm sounded. Not the general warning tone, the sharp, shrill, piercing alarm that cuts through every sound in the building. The alarm that signals something has happened, something that shouldn't have happened. My heart dropped before my feet moved. Every nerve in my body screamed before my mind even understood why. The air in the building shifted from tense to panicked. People on the floor turned sharply. Some froze, some ran, some yelled for help. I didn't hear their voices. I didn't hear the alarm grinding into my bones. I didn't hear the machines screeching as they were manually shut down. All I heard was the sound of my heartbeat crashing in my ears like a drum. I left the office and sprinted down the stairs before my thoughts could catch up to my body. The hallway blurred. The floor shook beneath my feet. Every instinct I had screamed, no, 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 no. And as I pushed through the crowd, forming at the end of Section C, bodies huddled, faces pale, eyes wide, a truth hit me so hard it almost knocked me backward. Something had gone wrong on the line, something that had been warned about, something that had been dismissed, something that had been predictable, something that Randall Pierce had chosen to ignore, something that changed everything. And deep down, even before I saw anything, even before I forced myself through the wall of workers, even before the world stopped around me, I already knew. My brother was involved. My brother was near that machine. My brother was on that line. My brother. I couldn't breathe. The moment I broke through the wall of workers, the world narrowed into a tunnel I couldn't escape. Everything around me dissolved. The noise, the movement, the fluorescent lights, all of it blurred into a dull hum, like my mind was trying to shield itself from what my eyes were about to see. People stepped aside slowly, reluctantly, with expressions that told me more than any words ever could. They weren't just shocked. They were devastated. They were afraid. They were guilty in that quiet, powerless way people feel when they witness something they couldn't stop. And then the space opened in front of me, a cold, hollow gap on the factory floor, a space machines had claimed, a space where life wasn't supposed to be lost, but it was. A space that no amount of training or policy or paperwork could ever make right again. Miguel's body was there, not covered yet, not moved, not hidden behind a curtain, exposed, broken, still. I will not describe the full details, not because I want to protect the story, but because some images are too sacred to turn into narration. Some things should remain behind the eyes of the person who lived them. But what I will say is this: what the machine took, it took violently. It wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. It wasn't merciful. It was the exact kind of catastrophic failure the workers had warned about, the kind of failure the maintenance reports predicted, the kind of failure that happened when someone with power believed money mattered more than human bones. My knees buckled. The floor met my body before I could stop it. My breath disappeared somewhere between my ribs and the back of my throat. I didn't scream. I couldn't scream. Grief didn't come out as sound. It came out as stillness. A stillness so deep and paralyzing that for a moment I wasn't sure my heart was beating at all. People around me shifted uneasily, not knowing whether to reach for me or step away. Men who had known Miguel for years wiped tears with trembling hands. Supervisors whispered frantically into radios, trying to sound in control when every word quivered. Someone from the medical team knelt beside the body, but their hands moved with the defeated precision of someone who already knew there was nothing to save. And in the middle of that frozen world, I felt a presence behind me. Heavy boots stepping closer, confident steps from a man who had no right to be confident. Not here, Not now. I didn't have to turn to know who it was. You can recognize the villain in your story by the way the air changes when he walks into the room. Randall Pierce. He stood just close enough for me to feel his shadow, but far enough to keep himself clean. I could sense him scanning the scene, not with horror, not with regret, not with anything resembling humanity, but with calculation. He wasn't seeing a tragedy. He was assessing liability. He wasn't seeing my brother. He was seeing a problem. He wasn't seeing a human being. He was seeing a threat to his bottom line. The men on the floor stared at him with disgust that simmered behind their shock. They had warned him. They had begged for repairs. They had filled out every damn form they could fill out. And he had laughed, that arrogant, dismissive laugh, dismissing their fear as complaining, calling their caution an overreaction. Now Miguel's body lay there as proof that they hadn't overreacted at all. They had foretold this, predicted this, tried to prevent this, and Randall had ignored every voice except the one in his pocket, counting the dollars he was saving. I could feel the rage rising inside me, but it wasn't hot, it wasn't wild, it wasn't loud. It was cold, a cold so sharp it sliced straight through my shock, a cold so deep it felt like a tendril wrapping around my spine, a cold so precise it didn't scream for vengeance. It planned for it. And yet, even then, staring at the broken outline of my brother's body, the part that hurt the most wasn't the death itself, it was the indifference, the horrible, unshakable truth that the man standing behind me, the man with the authority to stop that machine, the man who had chosen profit over people, wasn't grieving. He wasn't devastated. He wasn't shaken. He wasn't even surprised, because to him, this wasn't a tragedy. It was an inconvenience, something he would lie about in a report, something he would hide behind corporate language, something he would blame on operator error, something he believed he could cover with a safety meeting, a condolence email, a few mandatory trainings, and a renewal of the OSHA poster in the break room. To Randall, my brother's death wasn't a life lost. It was a problem to be solved. In that moment, watching him standing there with his jaw set and his eyes scanning the scene void of humanity, my grief rearranged itself into something new, resolve, deep, unwavering, terrifying resolve. Not for violence, not for chaos, not for retaliation that would get me arrested and him excused. No, I wanted something far worse for him. Truth. Truth uncovered. Truth exposed. Truth he couldn't spin or bury or deflect. Truth that would eat through the foundation of his career like acid. Truth that would strip the factory's walls of his posters and slogans and hollow promises. Truth that would follow his name for the rest of his life. I wanted the world to see him the way I saw him in that moment, a monster built from negligence, greed, and ego. But before truth comes vengeance, and before vengeance comes strategy. And strategy comes from something even darker, understanding how far evil will go to protect itself. Because while I stood there kneeling beside the broken remnants of my brother's life, Randall wasn't just thinking about the accident. He was already planning the cover-up. He was already writing the first line of his story. He was already erasing Miguel. And I wasn't going to let him. The minutes after Miguel's death blended into each other like muddy water, dark and impossible to separate. Paramedics moved with quiet urgency, but their movements had the finality of people who already knew they were tending to a body, not a patient. Workers whispered among themselves, their faces pale, their hands trembling, their eyes flicking between the scene and the exit, as if torn between grief and fear of retribution. Because in a place like that, tragedy didn't just break hearts, it threatened jobs. It threatened livelihoods. It threatened the fragile balance that kept food on tables and lights turned on. But while the rest of the room drowned in shock, Randall stood apart, physically, emotionally, morally. I didn't need to hear his words to know what he was thinking. His posture said everything: the stiff shoulders, the hands clasped behind his back, the slight tilt of his head as he scanned the scene like it was a puzzle he needed to solve before corporate found out. He was already assembling a version of events that exonerated him. He was already crafting a narrative to protect his status. He was already deciding who to blame. And I knew, with a clarity that cut through my numbness, that he intended to blame Miguel. Because blaming the dead is easy. They can't defend themselves. They can't speak. They can't contradict lies. They become whatever the powerful need them to become. Randall moved closer to the maintenance crew, speaking low, his gestures pointed. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew their shape. Phrases like, he should have. Why didn't he? Protocol states. And the worst of all, we need to be careful what goes into the report. The report. Of course he was thinking about the report already. Not the death, not the family, not the human being lying broken on the concrete. The report. The very first seed of the cover-up. A seed he planted in real time, right there, in front of all of us, as if grief were something only the poor had time for. A supervisor approached him, face ashen, hands shaking, clearly devastated, but Randall barely acknowledged the man's emotional collapse. He didn't put a hand on his shoulder. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't even pretend humanity. He spoke to him the way a CEO speaks to a malfunctioning computer, cold, terse, problem-focused. He pointed at the control panel. He gestured toward the emergency stop. He indicated the spot where Miguel had been standing. I could see the supervisors' faces shift from heartbreak to dread as they listened to him, because they understood what he was doing. He wasn't reviewing the tragedy. He was rewriting it, and he intended to make the rewrite official. As the paramedics finally lifted the sheet-covered body, my breath caught in my throat. A sound escaped me, not a scream, not a cry, but something hollow, something that hurt in a place I didn't know pain could reach. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from nausea, from the realization that I wasn't just losing my brother in death, I was losing him to the lies already forming. Because Randall didn't just want Miguel dead, he wanted him blamed. The facility manager arrived, red-faced and out of breath, and instead of grief, his first reaction was panic. Not over Miguel, over public relations, over OSHA, over downtime, over paperwork, over liability, over cost. Every word that passed between him and Randall was silent to me, but the body language was unmistakable. They weren't mourning, they were damage controlling. And that was when I realized the depth of their heartlessness. They didn't hesitate. They didn't stutter. They didn't falter. Danger wasn't new to them. Warnings weren't new to them. Accidents weren't new to them. The only new factor was that this time, the danger didn't injure someone. It killed someone. But their reactions were identical: minimize, redirect, rewrite, erase. A clipboard appeared in someone's hand. Forms were pulled out. Notes were taken. Boxes were checked. With each stroke of a pen, Miguel's life shrank into a sterile description of an incident, a statistic, a phrase in a report, a number on a chart. I knelt near the space where his body had been, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to accept the finality of what I had witnessed. Workers lingered around the edges, some crying silently, others staring blankly at the wall. Two men walked past me, murmuring something to each other with faces twisted in grief and guilt. One paused briefly, placing a trembling hand on the floor where Miguel had lain, a small gesture of respect in a place where respect was often optional. And all the while, Randall orchestrated the fallout like a conductor leading a symphony of denial. His voice grew firmer. His gestures grew sharper. His expression hardened into something cold and certain. He was already shaping the story for corporate, already shaping the story for OSHA, already shaping the story for us. And as his eyes briefly met mine across the floor, I saw something that changed the entire course of my life. He didn't look guilty. He didn't look sympathetic. He didn't look sorrowful. He looked annoyed. Annoyed that a worker's death would interrupt production. Annoyed that paperwork would pile up. Annoyed that inspectors would come. Annoyed that he'd have to address it at all. Annoyed that Miguel had died on his shift. And that was when something inside me hardened into something unbreakable. Not anger. Anger burns too quickly. Not rage. Rage clouds things. Not hatred. Hatred is emotional, and emotions were a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. What I felt was colder, sharper, cleaner. Resolve. Pure, lethal resolve. Because grief wants answers. Justice wants accountability. But resolve wants truth. Truth exposed. Truth made public. Truth dragged out of the shadows he had built around it like armor. I watched Randall walk away from the scene, already on his phone, already calling whoever he needed to manipulate the situation. I watched him shrug off the tragedy as if it were a scheduling conflict. I watched him treat my brother's death like a wrinkle in his workday, and I knew in that moment that I wasn't just going to fight him. I was going to dismantle him, piece by piece, lie by lie, decision by decision. One ignored warning at a time. This was no longer just about losing my brother. It was about the truth he deserved, the justice he was denied, the humanity Randall refused to acknowledge. And I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to threaten. I wasn't going to fight him with emotion. I was going to fight him with his own paperwork, his own signatures, his own emails, his own negligence. I was going to use the very system he hid behind to crush him. In the days following Miguel's death, I learned that grief doesn't move in a straight line the way people say it does. It curls, it twists, it folds itself into corners you don't even realize exist in your own chest. 1 minute you're numb, barely recognizing your own hands. The next, a memory flashes so vividly it feels like someone punched you. But the strangest part is how the world around you keeps spinning as if nothing happened, as if the floor didn't open up beneath your feet, as if your life didn't just divide itself into before and after. But the factory didn't slow down. Westline didn't slow down. Randall certainly didn't slow down. On the morning after the incident, I returned to the building, not because I was ready to face it, but because something inside me needed to see how the world behaved without my brother in it. The parking lot was already half full. The front entrance buzzed with workers arriving for their shifts. Some approached me cautiously, eyes soft with sympathy. Others couldn't meet my gaze because guilt is heavy even when it isn't your own. A few avoided me entirely, not out of cruelty, but out of fear that acknowledging what happened would make them vulnerable too. People in places like this are always walking a thin line between survival and obedience, and Randall knew how to balance that line perfectly. As soon as I stepped inside, I heard his voice echoing faintly down the hallway, calm, controlled, polished, the tone of a man who had spent the night rehearsing his statement rather than regretting his decisions. When I reached the break room, I saw the flyer already taped to the bulletin board, crisp, clean, printed, perfectly styled in corporate language. The heading made my stomach twist. Employee Safety Update. Below it, a paragraph describing the unfortunate accident that occurred. Then a reminder of the importance of following protocol at all times. Then a list of updated guidelines, none of which addressed the equipment failure that every worker on the floor had reported for months. And at the bottom, in neat blue font, a single line that sealed the first part of the cover-up. We are implementing additional training to ensure incidents like this never occur again. Incidents like this, not death, not loss, not human being, just an incident, a shift in production, a hiccup in workflow, a word used to erase responsibility. I stood there staring at the paper, my eyes reading each line, even though my brain refused to accept it. The words felt like acid dripping onto an open wound. They didn't mention the faulty machine. They didn't mention the ignored maintenance reports. They didn't mention the repeated requests for repairs. They didn't mention the supervisors who begged for downtime. They didn't mention Randall's dismissals, his smirks, his emails telling people to keep things moving. They blamed the workers. They blamed the floor. They blamed the people who had risked their lives every day. And they treated my brother as if he were a cautionary tale rather than a victim. The break room was quiet. People moved slowly, silently, making coffee, tying boots, avoiding eye contact. The flyer hung on the wall like an accusation, and in the doorway, Randall appeared. His smile was small, practiced, appropriate, his shirt crisp, his demeanor calm, his eyes scanning the room like a man checking inventory. He didn't look devastated. He didn't look sleepless. He didn't look like a man responsible for another man's death. He looked like a manager trying to get ahead of bad publicity. Behind him, the facility manager hovered with a folder in hand, the first draft of the official incident report, the one they would submit to OSHA, the one they would send to corporate headquarters, the one they were already shaping to protect themselves. Randall and the manager walked past me, but not before Randall cast a brief glance in my direction, the kind of look a person gives when they recognize you but refuse to acknowledge the depth of your pain. His eyes flickered with something that made my stomach turn. Annoyance. Annoyed that I was there. Annoyed that grief wasn't quiet. Annoyed that my presence meant witnesses. Annoyed that his carefully packaged narrative had a living contradiction standing in the hallway. I followed them down the hall from a distance, not because I intended to confront them, but because I needed to see how far the corruption reached. They entered the conference room, the same room where we held safety meetings, celebrations, annual reviews, the same room where my brother once sat during a company party, laughing with his friends, unaware he was working under a ticking time bomb. I stood outside and listened. Their voices were quiet, but their tones were unmistakable. Phrases like extenuating circumstances, employee error, and apparent missteps floated through the door. No mention of the broken sensor, no mention of the faulty conveyor, no mention of the months of warnings, no mention of the deferred maintenance requests, no mention of the neglected overhaul. Where truth should have been, there were excuses. Where accountability should have been, there were loopholes. Where humanity should have been, there was strategy. The cover-up wasn't just beginning. It was already in motion. I stepped away from the door, quietly, unnoticed, and walked toward the office upstairs. Not my office, Randall's. The door was open. His computer was still logged in. His desk was scattered with papers he'd been working on the night before. And that was when I realized something that changed everything. Corporate negligence leaves footprints, emails, reports, timestamps, maintenance logs, inspection failures, digital trails, paper trails, and Randall never expected anyone like me to look for them. He underestimated me. He underestimated the depth of my grief. He underestimated the strength of my resolve. He underestimated what a woman with nothing left to lose was capable of. I didn't touch anything. I didn't take anything. I didn't break any rules. I just looked long enough to see the patterns, looked long enough to see the red flags, looked long enough to recognize the lies he planned to hide behind, looked long enough to know exactly where the cracks in the system were. That morning, I didn't gather evidence. I gathered understanding. Understanding of how deeply the company protected itself. Understanding of how meticulously Randall curated his image. Understanding of how many reports he had ignored. Understanding of how many lives he put at risk. Understanding of how easily he lied. Understanding of how quickly he blamed. And most importantly, I understood how to destroy him, not through violence, not through confrontation, not through emotion, through exposure, through the truth he buried under paperwork and power, through the same documents he used to hide behind, through the same system he twisted to avoid accountability, through the same negligence that killed my brother, one quiet step at a time. For the first few days after Miguel's death, the world felt like it was made of fog. Everything was muffled. People's faces floated in and out of focus. I heard condolences the way you hear an echo from another room, distant, disconnected, hollow. The funeral pushed through those days like a wave I couldn't control. People hugged me, whispered prayers, placed hands on my shoulder. They talked about his smile, his work ethic, his kindness. They told stories about moments I had forgotten, moments I never knew existed. I stood there absorbing it all silently, the weight of every memory pressing against my chest. While I mourned, Randall moved on. I saw it in the emails forwarded to me by accident. I saw it in the updated production schedule posted 2 days after Miguel died. I saw it in the way management walked through the floor, heads high, voices firm, expressions dry. I saw it in the revised safety guidelines that were printed and distributed like flimsy shields against liability. Randall didn't slow down. He didn't waver. He didn't reflect. He tightened the reins. He made sure every report submitted after the accident went through him. He instructed supervisors to maintain discretion during the investigation. He told the maintenance crew to standardize language in their logs. He pressured people to stay quiet, and the workers, the men and women who had known Miguel, who had worked beside him, who had felt the danger in their bones, they were afraid. Not because they didn't want to speak, but because speaking meant risking the one thing they had, their job. In a town like ours, losing a job wasn't just losing income. It was losing health care, losing stability, losing any sense of control. Randall knew that, and he weaponized it. But he didn't understand me, because grief had replaced fear inside me, and grief, when sharpened by injustice, becomes something dangerous. I returned to Westline a week after the accident. I walked through the building as if I were invisible, and in some ways I was. People avoided looking at me, unsure whether their sympathy would help or hurt. The office staff offered tight smiles. The floor workers nodded quietly. Supervisors turned away. Managers hushed their voices when I passed by. Everyone knew. Everyone felt guilty. Everyone felt afraid. Everyone felt helpless. But no one looked more out of place than Randall, because I could see it now, on his face, in his posture, in the way he straightened papers that didn't need straightening. He knew I wasn't done. And that fear, subtle as it was, energized me. I hadn't spoken at the funeral. I hadn't raised my voice at the factory. I hadn't confronted anyone. I hadn't broken down in public. I had done nothing that he could use against me. Nothing emotional, nothing reactive, nothing irrational. And that silence made him uneasy, because when the broken scream, the guilty know how to respond. But when the broken become quiet, truly, deeply quiet, it's harder to predict what comes next. I sat at my desk that morning, staring at the screen without seeing it. Emails blurred, numbers swam. The office buzzed softly around me, a machine of its own, one built on denial and routine. But as I reached for the drawer, my fingers touched something that sent a shiver up my spine. A stack of maintenance logs, not the sanitized ones Randall had instructed people to submit, not the revised versions management approved, the originals, handwritten, time-stamped, unedited, unfiltered. One of the maintenance workers must have slipped them into my drawer when no one was looking. No note attached, no explanation, no signature, just evidence, raw, honest evidence, quietly delivered by someone who couldn't speak but refused to stay complicit. My heart pounded as I sifted through the papers. Repeated complaints about the conveyor belt, warnings about failing components, requests for shutdowns, notes about temporary fixes, descriptions of malfunctioning sensors, escalation attempts that were ignored, detailed mentions of the exact issue that killed Miguel. And then, buried near the back, one page that made my breath stop. A report filed 2 months before the accident. The technician wrote that the conveyor belt's central motor was overheating, that the emergency stop was inconsistent, that electrical wiring was exposed in a way that posed a serious hazard, and that maintenance recommends immediate shutdown for repair. At the bottom, 2 signatures, the technician's and Randall's. Beside Randall's signature, a check mark next to deferred. Deferred, not rejected, not reviewed. Deferred, meaning he saw it, understood it, and chose not to act. My hands trembled, not with shock, but with validation. I had believed he ignored the warnings. Now I had proof, and not just proof he had personally acknowledged, proof that his negligence had a paper trail, proof that could outlive his lies. I could have cried right then, but the tears didn't come. What came instead was something stronger, a realization. Randall had protected himself with the same system that killed my brother. But systems have cracks, and men like Randall always leave traces of their arrogance behind. I carefully scanned every page, memorizing details, connecting dates, cross-referencing who submitted what. Some reports aligned with the ones in the official system, others didn't. Some were dated on days where the digital logs claimed no issues reported. Some described faults that mysteriously disappeared from the company's files. This wasn't negligence accidentally overlooked. This was negligence intentionally buried. And if these papers had reached me quietly, who else had tried to speak before being silenced? Who else had submitted concerns that vanished after they hit Randall's desk? How many near misses were hidden in drawers and locked cabinets? I sat back in my chair, staring at the pile of truth in front of me. And for the first time since Miguel died, I felt something other than grief. Control. Just a sliver. Just enough to catch my breath. Just enough to steady my hands. Randall had built his power on the assumption that no one beneath him had the resources or courage to challenge him, but he didn't know me anymore. He didn't know what grief could do to a person, what injustice could wake inside them, what resolve could blossom in the cracks tragedy left behind. I slid the documents into my bag quietly, carefully, methodically, preserving the truth he tried to bury, truth that would one day become the weapon he never saw coming, truth that would one day echo through a courtroom, truth that would one day be read aloud by a judge, truth that would one day unravel his empire. But gathering reports was only the beginning, because negligence is rarely a single decision. It's a pattern, a behavior, a culture, and patterns leave trails. When I left the office that evening, the sky was already bruising into darkness, the kind of heavy twilight that settles over industrial towns like a blanket soaked in rain. The air was cold enough to sting when I inhaled, but my body barely registered it. My mind was still inside the building, moving through files and reports and digital trails like a ghost who refused to rest. I carried the weight of the maintenance logs in my bag, but their weight wasn't paper. It was truth. Truth so sharp it felt like it could cut through steel. As I drove home, the streetlights smeared into long streaks beside me. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't need sound to distract me. Silence was the only thing that felt honest now. The world outside had kept moving after Miguel's death, but inside me, something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. Grief had been a wound. Now it was a weapon. I reached home, and the house greeted me with the kind of emptiness I had only ever imagined in nightmares. His shoes were still near the door. His jacket still hung on the hook. The indentation on the couch cushion was still there from the last time he'd fallen asleep watching TV after a long shift. The air still carried a faint trace of the industrial cleaner he always brought home on his clothes. But he wasn't inside those things anymore. The belongings were shells of him, and the shell was all I had left. I set my bag on the table, pulled out the stack of papers, and spread them across the wood like pieces of a puzzle. Under the overhead light, the pages looked almost innocent, slightly curled, ink smudged from sweat or grease or exhaustion, handwriting slanted from haste, technical terms scribbled in margins, dates and times recorded with mechanical consistency, line after line of warnings, requests, pleas. Miguel's death had a history, a documented, time-stamped, undeniable history, and the man who killed him had signed his name next to the decision to ignore it. I stared at the documents for a long time, not blinking, not moving, just absorbing the full gravity of what was in front of me. Pages that would have saved Miguel's life if anyone had cared enough to act on them. Pages that would burn through any defense Randall tried to manufacture. Pages that were never meant to see daylight again. But daylight was coming, and I was the one who would bring it. I pulled out my laptop and opened it slowly, almost ceremonially. The screen's glow reflected off the scattered papers like light bouncing off broken glass. I began organizing everything I had collected, logging dates, cross-referencing reports, sorting documents into folders. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't dramatic. It was tedious, painstaking, methodical, and necessary. Every file I opened revealed another inconsistency. Every timestamp revealed another cover-up. Every revision revealed another lie. Every missing entry revealed a pattern so deliberate it made my skin crawl. Westline wasn't just a dangerous workplace. It was a graveyard of negligence waiting to be filled. And Miguel was only the first headstone in a cemetery they planned to pretend didn't exist. I opened the corporate communication archives next, a labyrinth of emails and memos. Most were routine, some were policy reminders, others were weekly updates, but buried between threads, deep in subfolders, hidden in what appeared to be harmless exchanges, I found cracks. Emails from supervisors mentioning safety concerns, emails from technicians asking for follow-ups, emails from maintenance, logging repeated sensor failures, all followed by responses from higher-ups saying things like, prioritize production, or hold off until review, or not critical for now. I saw phrases Randall loved to use, phrases I recognized from overheard meetings, from his carefully curated company speeches. Sometimes he signed them, sometimes he approved them, sometimes he forwarded them with a single sentence that chilled me. We'll handle it later, later, as if later was a promise, later, as if later always came, later, as if life paused long enough for him to catch up, but later cost Miguel his life, later cost workers their sense of safety, later cost families their peace, later cost a town its trust in the people who claimed to protect them. Randall's digital fingerprints were everywhere, smudged across every cover-up like a greasy handprint on clean glass. He had been rewriting danger in real time, covering it with corporate language sharp enough to cut through accountability, but no one had ever connected the dots before, because no one ever had a reason to, until now. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. The more I read, the more my anger hardened, not the loud kind that bursts, but the quiet kind that fortifies. It became structure, spine, momentum. I could feel myself transforming, bone by bone, breath by breath, thought by thought, into someone I barely recognized, someone who wasn't afraid anymore, someone who wouldn't look away, someone who wouldn't let a monster walk free. By the time dawn crept through the curtains, the documents were organized into categories. I had maintenance logs showing long-term neglect, revision trails showing intentional suppression, audit drafts showing erased evidence, emails showing directives to ignore safety, red flags, timestamps proving Randall's involvement, technician notes highlighting the exact malfunction that killed Miguel, deleted entries that weren't truly deleted, only hidden, and something else, something unexpected. Anonymous employee complaints submitted through the internal system, some dated months before the accident, some describing near-fatal incidents on the same machine, some begging for action, some describing fear, some mentioning a culture of intimidation. Not one was addressed. Not one was escalated. Not one led to change. Westline wasn't negligent. It was predatory, and the man leading it was a predator too, one who fed on silence, on fear, on the inability of workers to risk their livelihoods by speaking up. By the time the sun rose fully, casting pale gold across the room, I had enough evidence to bury him professionally, enough to bury his reputation, enough to bury his career, enough to bury the entire culture he built. But evidence alone wasn't enough. Truth isn't justice unless people see it. Randall had built his empire on hiding the truth in shadows. So I made a decision that would change everything. I would drag him out of those shadows, into daylight, into scrutiny, into consequences. And when he fell, he wouldn't just fall alone. He would fall publicly, completely, finally. The more evidence I gathered, the more the shape of Randall's empire revealed itself. Not as a workplace, not as a factory, not as a company built on industry and grit, but as a fortress built on fear. Every log I uncovered, every email I saved, every draft I read, every whistleblower note I found, all of it painted the same picture. A man who believed he was too powerful to fall, a man who believed workers were replaceable, a man who believed nobody would ever challenge him because nobody had the luxury of risking their jobs, a man who wore confidence like armor, never realizing armor does nothing when the attack comes from beneath his feet. But I wasn't ready to strike yet, not until the truth was bigger than my grief, not until every piece was in place, Not until the foundation beneath Randall was thin enough to crack with a whisper. And so I kept digging, quietly, patiently, relentlessly. I began identifying workers who had submitted the anonymous complaints. The language in their notes, the phrasing, the references were familiar enough that I could match them to faces on the floor. Men who always glanced at Section C with dread, women who walked a little farther around the conveyor belt than necessary, people who avoided eye contact whenever equipment malfunctioned. One by one, I approached them, never with confrontation, never with accusation, never with desperation. I approached them the way you approach animals who have been conditioned to expect harm, with patience, with gentleness, with silence that offers safety instead of pressure. I didn't ask them to speak. I didn't ask them to incriminate themselves. I didn't ask them to risk their jobs. I simply let them know that I knew, that I had seen their reports, that I believed them, that I wasn't afraid. And slowly, like doors cracking open in a long hallway, the truth emerged from their silence. One worker revealed that he had submitted 6 reports in 2 months about the same malfunction that killed Miguel. All were dismissed. Another admitted she had been written up after refusing to run the machine during a malfunction. A maintenance tech, older, weary, eyes dimmed by years of being ignored, showed me a notebook he kept hidden at home. A notebook full of undocumented issues he stopped reporting because it never mattered anyway. Piece by piece, the story grew. And then, unexpectedly, the final piece arrived in the form of a man I had never spoken to before. He was a night shift supervisor, quiet, tired, always kept to himself. I found him waiting beside my car in the parking lot, hands shaking slightly, eyes rimmed with sleepless desperation. He didn't speak, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. He simply handed me a flash drive, nodded once, and walked away. On that drive were internal communications, ones I hadn't been able to access. Emails between Randall and upper management, messages that casually dismissed maintenance concerns, threads where workers' fears were called exaggerations, notes about minimizing downtime, plans to push production quotas even when equipment failed. But the worst file on that drive was the one that broke me and rebuilt me in the same breath. A memo written 2 weeks before the accident, marked urgent, addressed directly to Randall. It detailed the conveyor's mechanical instability, predicted a serious injury or fatal incident, recommended immediate shutdown. Randall's response was attached below it. 2 words, not now. Not now. 2 words that killed my brother. 2 words that proved the malicious indifference behind every decision he made. 2 words that echoed in my chest like gunshots. 2 words that solidified my purpose so completely I felt my entire spirit harden into steel. Not now became my battle cry, because if justice didn't come, then it would come now, on my terms, by my hands, through the truth he tried to bury. I organized everything, scanned every document, backed up every file, stored copies in places he could never reach, cross-referenced every discrepancy, prepared a timeline so ironclad it could withstand an earthquake. When the case was complete, when the truth was watertight, I sent it anonymously to 3 places simultaneously: OSHA, the State Attorney General's office, and the local investigative news outlet that specialized in corruption. I didn't sign my name. I didn't need to. The truth would speak louder than I ever could. The fallout began slowly, the way earthquakes do, tiny tremors felt by only a few. Inspectors arrived unannounced. Meetings were called behind closed doors. Supervisors whispered. Workers exchanged glances. unsure of what storm was forming above their heads. Then the tremors became quakes. The investigative journalists published a story so thorough, so damning, so rooted in evidence that it ignited the entire town. The headline alone cut through the false narrative like a blade. Warnings ignored. How Westline's negligence led to a preventable death. Randall's face was on every local TV station. His emails were printed in the article. His signature was exposed. His decisions were documented. His arrogance was dissected, line by line. He couldn't hide. He couldn't spin the truth. He couldn't bury the evidence. It was everywhere. OSHA launched a full-scale investigation. The Attorney General opened a case. Workers began speaking publicly. Anonymous reports increased. Journalists dug deeper. The walls of Randall's fortress crumbled faster than he could patch them. And the final blow came the day he was summoned to court. I sat in the back of the courtroom, not because I needed to see him fall, but because I needed to see the truth stand. The judge read out loud the memo where he wrote, "Not now." The judge read out loud the maintenance logs he ignored. The judge read out loud the revision trails he altered. The judge read out loud the emails where he dismissed safety concerns. The judge read out loud the report predicting a fatality in Section C. Every word was a hammer. Every sentence was a strike. Every document was a nail in the coffin of his career. Randall's face lost all color. His hands shook. His confidence evaporated. His name, once synonymous with power, became synonymous with negligence. He was ordered to pay millions in penalties. He was charged with criminal negligence. He was barred from holding managerial positions. He was removed from the company permanently. He faced civil suits from multiple workers. His reputation disintegrated. His empire collapsed, and for the first time since Miguel's death, I felt something close to breath. Victory. A quiet, steady, righteous victory. Because I didn't scream. I didn't fight with my fists. I didn't lose control. I used the truth he buried. I used the lies he crafted. I used the system he manipulated. I used the arrogance he relied on. I used everything he gave me against him. And when the dust settled, when everything he built was reduced to rubble, one truth remained standing, etched into the world in a way no cover-up could erase. Miguel didn't die because of an accident. Miguel died because of a choice made by a man who believed human lives were delays, a man who believed negligence would never catch up to him, a man who believed workers would forever stay silent. But he forgot one thing. Grief doesn't stay silent. Justice doesn't stay buried. Truth doesn't stay erased. And a sister with nothing left to lose, she doesn't stay quiet. She rises, she fights, she wins, and she brings the villain down harder than he ever imagined possible.